Hi everyone, John Munro here with introducing another interview, the third in my Stealing Car series of conversations with different experts, people who have different insights into car culture and its relation with other forms of power. And this time, for my third conversation, I had the opportunity to speak with Dian Nostikasari, who is a professor in the environmental science and sustainability department at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. And I was really lucky to have the opportunity to chat with Dian. She is an expert in city planning, but she takes a really, as you'll see in our conversation, a really interdisciplinary approach to the topic. And some of her work, and this is what caught my attention initially, some of her work speaks to the way that knowledge informs urban planning, and particularly the way that different knowledges kind of interact in a field of power, and how certain forms of knowledge are often privileged, and certain assumptions are built in to different kinds of sensibilities and ways of approaching who has say in how cities are put together, how they're laid out, how they operate, how they're planned, etc. So this is a topic I'm really interested in terms of who has say over how the urban space looks, who it's for, and so on. So we talked about that, and she has an excellent article with Colleen Casey on this very topic, and I'll post this below. They did some interviews with city planners, with different people. In this particular case, in the article I'm thinking of, in Dallas, Fort Worth, in Texas. And so they're talking to city planners and road engineers and other kind of experts, and thinking about how they conceive of inclusion and how they conceive of ways of sort of widening participation, I guess to use one term, around who has say in city planning kinds of questions. But as you can imagine, there are many sort of assumptions built into that, and sometimes what is thought of as inclusion is pretty narrow in terms of its framework. So we talked about this work, and then we connected it, or I tried to connect it. I asked some questions which were very, very instructive for me to hear Dian's answers on, in terms of this idea of stealing cars, this idea that automobility as a form of privatization of public space constitutes a kind of theft of the commons, if you will. So we talked about that. We talked about different city planning and kind of questions of automobility, particularly in the Indonesian and US context, but definitely with lessons for geographies far beyond that as well. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I recommend you check it out. Have a good day. Okay, well, hi everyone. My name is John Munro, and I teach US history at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Today I'm speaking with Dian Nostikasari about the intersection between car culture and other structures of power as part of the research for a new project I'm working on entitled Stealing Cars. Dr. Dian Nostikasari is Assistant Professor of Environmental Science and Sustainability at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. Her work focuses on transportation equity, health, environmental justice, and community development through meaningful engagement. She utilizes interdisciplinary approaches to make connections between how the production of the built environment affects access to socioeconomic opportunities and other dimensions, such as sustainability, of our lived experience. Dr. Nostikasari's research takes a comparative approach to looking at metropolitan regions in the United States that are connected to global development. Well, hello, Dian. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you for having me, John.
Great. So I had a few questions I just wanted to walk through. And the first one, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm curious, how did you become interested in urban transportation and city planning as academic subjects?
Sure. So it goes way back, I guess. I studied architecture and then practiced a little bit. And I knew that I wanted to if I ever got to graduate program, I wanted to kind of further kind of extend my understandings of the relationship between people and the built environment outside of the building spaces. And so urban planning seems like a natural kind of progression for that. And I think, so transportation and land use is something that is really kind of the bread and butter in urban planning. So that's how I found myself in that area. And I became interested in transportation, I think, just kind of reflecting on how it played such a big role for me as a young professional, right, in Jakarta, who relied solely on public transportation. And so, and then coming to Texas, which just, is just such a very different landscape in terms of like transportation accessibility. It was such a stark contrast. And, kind of as I learned more about how, how planning approach the transportation issues, I became more interested in terms of specific planning practices that that thinks about transportation needs and how the approaches in how meeting the planning practices meet those demands, right? Meet those needs. So I took an urban transportation class actually on my later years in the graduate program that was taught by a civil engineering professors. And so they were, and so it was in the civil engineering department. So we actually went through the 4-step travel demand modeling process. And it was, the class was composed of kind of a mixture of urban planning students and engineers, civic and civil engineering students. And what's interesting about that class and how that leads me to questions later on in my own research is the proposed solutions that was offered by the different students from the different disciplines and how, the different approaches that leads to those solutions. So for example, part of the project was to think about the modeling process and how to resolve congestion issues in kind of a city level. And the urban planning students would, including myself, would think about the different policy aspects of it. So like gas tax and congestion pricing or carpooling. One of the conclusion of the class was actually when we look into the model, one of the most effective way of addressing congestion was car sharing, right? Carpooling. And but then from the civil engineering students, we get solutions, something like adding new lanes, right? Just kind of having those tweak changes. And so thinking about the system holistically, but also how policy is very much connected to that. It was a really, really eye-opening experience for me. And that leads me to questions later on in my own dissertation.
Wow, that's so fascinating. It's so interesting how the different constituencies just within that class set within this, I can picture the graduate seminaring almost 2 camps of kind of training, assumptions, and interpretations. Were there lively discussions?
No, I don't remember lively discussions in terms of, where it was contentious or not. It was more of kind of, oh, wow, we came into realizations that congestion issues is not just about the physical building of roads, right? That is not just about providing more space for cars to travel, which, I think pragmatically that solves the problem. But then later on, the congestion kind of just moves to other places in the city. So that there was just kind of a larger system thinking that needs to be happening there to solve issues like that. And also, the interesting part of that was like the disciplinary training, right? That leads to kind of us thinking about those solutions.
Yeah, fascinating. Another thing you said, which sort of leads into another question I wanted to ask you when you were mentioning your experience before in Jakarta, I wanted to ask you about your international experience professionally and also experientially. I'm interested in, for me, I'm interested in how, you know, what we might call car culture manifests itself as in kind of different national ways, but obviously it's a transnational phenomenon as well. So with that, I was curious if you had any reflections on differences between the experience of kind of transport or automobility on public transit or in cars in Indonesia, in I think national spaces, Indonesia and the United States, or Jakarta versus you know, Arlington, or Jakarta versus Des Moines. Any
Mhm.
thoughts on some of these comparisons?
Yeah, so I guess, like I said, as a young professional, right, practicing, I often go from east side of Jakarta to west side of Jakarta, north and south, to kind of the very different projects that I'm involved in, and because I did rely solely on kind of public transportation. I spent a lot of time on buses, and you know, I remember the rush hours and just kind of the struggle of getting space, right? Because if you think about Jakarta as a kind of this mega city, it's really hard to kind of picture it if you lived in Texas all your life, or you know, kind of Des Moines, where there's hardly any traffic. I guess so. And also, what can reflect from that experience is not just on the kind of the the density side of kind of being in a transportation system like that, but also um, from the experiences um, of living that and being able to see others differently, as if you compare to if you were just driving in your own private car space, right? So you don't get that experience of like, you know, just kind of rubbing shoulders with others, and which can be good, which can be awful as well, right? But then it just gives you that range of kind of human experiences that you don't have in a dominant private car culture. And that would be kind of, you know, how I can explain the stark contrast of coming to later on study in Arlington, Texas, which is a suburb community, and then now I'm living in Des Moines, which has hardly any traffic, right? So, and then in terms of kind of the traffic conditions, I can speak from, you know, just me thinking the last time I went to Jakarta was 2014, and I cannot imagine if the traffic conditions of 2014, and if I still had to work the way I did early on in my career, that I could only go to 2 places perhaps in a whole day just because of the traffic. And so one of the things from kind of that urban transportation class that I remember learning about was that if you have a transportation system where there is no rush hour, where traffic congestion is almost virtually any other hours, then that transportation system is broken. To be fair, I think the government, you know, both the national government and the regional government in Jakarta has worked really hard in introducing bus rapid transits and expanding that system network. And I had some experience in kind of utilizing that system as well. And at the same time, I also remember that I had to wait over an hour to just get into the bus, right? Because it was just such a big demand. And also, I think in terms of culture, because public transportation and walking is probably more of the norm from, you know, people in Jakarta, in cities like Jakarta. car the car represents something other than a modes of transportation, which to some extent also I can get at that sense here as well, but then not to the way, that it's just not something that was really accessible by most people there.
That's so interesting. So exactly, that's true in many cultures, but it's kind of sounds like it's more of a symbol because it's more not quite elite, but closer to elite than say in Des Moines or Dallas or something, where a much broader sort of range of the population are driving or transporting in cars. What's public transit like in Des Moines?
It's modest. I think because Des Moines is not a real, compared to Houston or Dallas Fort Worth, it's not a very big. Sorry. It's so let me think about this. It serves mostly the city, which you would find, in the typical region. It's accessible in a way that it connects important places. There are some routes that is really connects like hospitals and kind of all the important places and all the way to downtown. The wait time is not as as you will find in kind of places that are still expanding the transit, that you'd often have to wait 20 minutes for a bus. So if you miss something, then I'd have to call someone to pick me up if I were in a rush. And so, and I think that goes to say in terms of public transit in most places that it takes a certain kind of knowledge and willingness to plan your day ahead if you were to utilize public transit compared to kind of, driving in most places.
Yeah, very interesting. Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about your work. I really enjoyed the article that you co-authored with Colleen Casey entitled Institutional Barriers in the Co-Production of Knowledge for Transportation Planning, which appeared in Planning Theory and Practice. And here you're focusing on the Dallas-Fort Worth, another mega city, I'd guess. And here you're talking about when it comes to urban planning, how certain kinds of knowledge are privileged over others. Can you explain a little bit the argument of this article and its implications for urban democracy?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so in that particular article, we look into the idea of inclusion, and one of the ways that inclusion has been institutionally adopted by the federal government is kind of through that requirement where all projects and programs that are getting funds from the federal government, they need to go through a public participation process. And I think, and there's a lot of nuances to that, right? Because the level of meaningful engagement in those process can vary depending on how you design the process, how you do the outreach, the types of communities that you work with and engage with, and even through the specific details on if you have public meetings, do you provide options for childcare, for example, to ensure people are really having that space to kind of participate and have their voices heard. So for that article, we kind of look into even the idea of whether or not inclusion happens at the planning practice. And we look into how planners and modelers interact with the data, or kind of even their perceptions and attitude on what comes out of the planning process, the modeling process specifically. So it came out of the a critique to the model, right? Kind of the idea that the model, or the four-step model in this case, is the one that the Dallas-Fort Worth central government still uses to draft the travel demand, long-term demand. And the idea that the model is a tool that provides the ability for planners and to reflect on different scenarios and inform policymakers, right, elected officials on what are the potential implications of their decisions if they do nothing versus if they adopt a series of projects to address, transportation issues in the region. So, thinking about, we found that from those series of interviews and thinking about the context in the region, that the exclusion process can happen even at the beginning, where a certain data and certain knowledges are that comes out of that information from that data are kind of more privileged than others, in a way that even thinking about how the outcomes are being communicated by planners to the elected officials influence the way that decisions can be made. Even in thinking about literatures that will look into the way scientists, even scientists and kind of the modelers interact with the data, and thinking about what should we exclude and what should we include, and through the analysis process that could have implications. So our argument was really based on kind of, when we think about inclusion, it's often thinking about who is at the table, who gets to say at the table, but we also need to think beyond in terms of kind of thinking about the institutional context that in which the information that gets discussed at the table comes out, right? So that the assumptions that are behind that information should be made clear when we are discussing a topic, and to have like really meaningful discussion and participation. So implications on that. So I think, and we found also that from that series of interview where planners would often adjust the way they communicate with constituents versus the public, right? So, and the planning process goes through this process of black boxing, where only the input and the output is known, and so like the whole middle process is something that only the inner workings or the institutional level kind of get a privilege over. And so it's very hard for communities that are going to be impacted by these projects to challenge that black box in the end, because it requires them to have certain knowledge and certain access and like money, right, to kind of also talk to kind of experts that are able to translate that for them in a way that they can kind of then mobilize for that. And we see this happening in many highway expansion projects in the US, particularly, the one that I know of. I'm actually looking into oppositions to the expansions of North I-45 highway in Houston, Texas, where we see communities there mobilizing and drafting their own narratives, their own stories, to argue that that the expansion is not really benefiting the region and specifically really impacting the local communities there.
Yeah, that's I mean, I'll ask you more towards the end of our discussion too about kind of resistances, because that's really, a key part of all of this. So it's really fascinating to see that your research is going in that direction as well. I mean, and a couple other things in this article, though. One thing I was struck by was just the care with language that you used. Even if we think about the difference between the words data versus knowledge, that's already setting up a kind of, knowledge can be every day, and data has a kind of scientific sort of set of associations with it. So there are so many ways in which, as you say, inclusion and inclusion can kind of work subtly as well. Another thing that was really fascinating in the article was the way that you talked about how values become embedded and assumed before, as you were saying a minute ago, but thinking about inclusion in general, many people, from all sides of the table would be like, well, we're for that. There's not very many people who are against it in these kind of conversations. But it's another thing to try to uncover, and that's exactly what your work, effectively does, to uncover the fact that such kind of assumptions are there in the first place. There was one example, I think it's called, correct me if I'm wrong, vehicle miles traveled, VMT, and you said that VMT, it's just assumed within it that this means sort of car vehicles. This doesn't mean people on bicycles or walking or what have you. So in the interview process, did you have interesting conversations with planners and other experts about this? Were people kind of resistant, like, no, I don't have assumptions, or how did that part work?
That's a very interesting question. Well, yeah, so the interviews includes interviews with modelers and planners, right? So for the modelers, we had to do a group interview instead of individual interviews. And it was interesting to kind of go through that process where I would often ask questions about participation or kind of communication with the public, and there was a lot of resistance in terms of, we don't really deal with that. I also learned from that process that modelers actually have to sign a non-disclosure agreement that they're not allowed to talk to the media. And so, I think they were really expecting a different set of questions from me. And, it was like they were expecting more of the technical questions rather than, what are the assumptions and how are you including public input into the model, for example, like, do you even consider that at all? So it was quite an interesting and eye-opening interview process for me, where if I think I was already I was, and then also there was also the different dynamics of power in terms of having an interview with 3 people at the different levels of management, right? Where a person would likely to kind of just take over the interview. And so I think it was interesting because I think when I had a discussions about that interview with my dissertation chair, it kind of reminded her of kind of the idea of the Federal Reserve and how it was just also very hush-hush. But I think and not to kind of say that, but in a way, but it was just really interesting to see that they were really expecting different set of questions from me when I talk about modeling. With the planners, I found that it really depends on the type of planning philosophy that they adopted, because I think when we kind of get a sense of kind of people who have adopted a line of a rational planning approach, right, versus those that kind of are a little bit more focusing on the engagement process and thinking about how to integrate inputs into the system. And so it also, and that's why in the article we talk about the different ways even planners engage with each other when they talk about these outcomes, because some planners, like particular planner that we talk to, would actually be saying, like, I would want to kind of challenge the model. If I would want my, people who I work with to kind of question if I see something, and I know that from experience that artery doesn't have that much capacity, and I see the numbers are off, so I would, I would want to look into that, versus we would get responses such as, everything depends on data, right, from the modelers, where they really do put emphasis on kind of what specific data that they need that would get that would be the appropriate input for the model. Yeah, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's just also just so interesting to think about, like, the varied layers of power, right? There's all the layers of power that sort of are in between communities getting into the room, And then once there, the layers of power within the room in terms of the assumptions and all of the different kind of aspects of it. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of more specific sort of automobility dimension of all of this, because this article also, I mean, it's about cars, it's about planning. And, you know, one of the contentions in the article is that prioritizing planning for the private car can entrench urban inequality. What is the relationship between these things?
Yeah, so I think even if we think about inequality as kind of access to space, right? From that perspective, we see, you know, a lot of investment historically that has been, you know, kind of largely going into road constructions, for example, highway expansions. And if we look into kind of, you know, even just the budget composition of transportation infrastructure, it's incomparable, right? The kind of how many billions that goes into road infrastructure versus other types of transportation modes. And, you know, I think from that perspective, we can think of inequality as kind of that uneven distribution of resources, even financially, and even thinking about the budgeting. And it is kind of based on the assumptions, right, that of needs, that we do need to spend that much money for roads because that's what people want or need. And so it just goes again to the assumptions and like what you said with the vehicle miles travel, and what metrics do we use to then develop our understanding of that needs and demands. And yeah, and also, you know, I think urban inequality in terms of transportation access is something that is, you know, that is still ongoing, right? I remember, I think we cited an article by a geographer who looks into how working women of low income what their activity space would look like if they didn't have access to reliable car. So if they had to use public transit, for example, they would have to sacrifice a lot of activities in terms of, you know, not go to places, cut on some places and things like that. And that limits our ability to participate in a meaningful way in, you know, kind of in society, because our ability to get to destinations is really a precursor to kind of our ability to engage in activities in those destinations. Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, in the United States and definitely elsewhere, including the UK where I am, there's a, you know, there's a very, must be said, racial component to all of this. Thinking about who the suburbs were built for and who those roads were meant to convey from A to B and so on, as well as obviously a gender dimension of power to all of this stuff as well. I always find it interesting how the language of intersectionality, which, you know, permeates so many conversations, that it doesn't get used as much as it might in specifically these conversations, because it comes from the word intersection, like it comes exactly from, you know, a kind of a meeting of two roads, a discussion of kind of how, you know, public space of roads is laid out. And in a sense, intersectionality is a planning metaphor, we might say, you know, because of where it comes from. And it always just seems so relevant to all of the ways in which this stuff plays out. Were there many conversations about race specifically in your, or gender for that matter, in the interviews that you conducted?
No, not at all, right? I think we couldn't even peel those layers, because even just kind of thinking about general public engagement was already something that was really preoccupying these spaces, right? Just even thinking about one, you know, there are some planners who are concerned about how do we even get people to participate, where we ask them for input, where in a lot of these situations, in a lot of public participation process that is kind of institutionalized, people don't come to meetings unless they know for sure that that particular project is going to impact them, right? So most people don't come to meetings. And then when they do come to meetings, if they are flooded with a lot of jargons, and then they get, you know, how do I even understand? And so, and some of them would be coming to meeting to bring up everyday issues. And that's why we kind of, you know, really try to peel through that layers. What is data? What is information? Because, and what is lived data according to lived experiences? And how, you know, how do we even begin to bridge that? And I think that's a big question as well, in terms of even if we do get public input in that official public participation meetings or process, how do they even integrate it into the long range visioning, into the actual kind of modeling process that in such a big, that really is a very instrumental tool in the planning process. So yeah, so there's no, we didn't really ask because, you know, we were just really trying, even if, you know, to just get into that idea of like, what does participation look like, or how are you even including that in the process?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it sounds too like in some ways, and this is another reason why this research is so important, is because in some ways it's the beginning of a conversation. If you compare, you know, the kind of assumptions that would go into planning and urban development, like say with the beginning of the interstate system in the 1950s, you know, it's entirely top down. And obviously this was very much about racial power as well, explicitly so in example after example, of course, where the freeways were built and all of that. So it's also interesting, like, you know, those important topics weren't coming up directly, but you're also, this is an entry point to a conversation that's developing, and obviously those will be part of the larger conversation that this is part of as well. So it's also just like, you know, fascinating to think about how this is just opening this up in the first place to even talk about participation, let alone then what the content is going to be of that conversation as it develops.
Yeah, and I think it's also, as you said, it's really interesting to think about, you know, for example, the opposition for the highway expansion in Houston is a movement that is really intersectional, and, you know, it includes professionals, it includes residents, and it includes, you know, from all kind of backgrounds. And so the movement on that side, the mobilization on that side is very much intersectional, but it's as if it's like two very different space, right? Because kind of even the Texas Department of Transportation system now, I think the last word that I heard it was that they basically say that, you know, take this money, build it as we want it, right? Expand it, or not at all, where on the other side, the mobilization or the movement just really wanted to have that conversation. We're not asking that we don't want the expansion. We just want to do it in a way that doesn't displace people, for example.
Wow. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that right now, because that is so fascinating. So are there protests? What do these conversations look like? Are people coming to meetings? What is the way in which the power structure is interacting with other constituencies as this kind of, I mean, resistance sounds like one word for it, but it also sounds like rethinking. It's not just saying no, it's saying, you know, include the aspirations and the agenda and the needs of different communities in this planning. So how does this stuff look as it's playing out right now?
Well, I'm not sure I can entirely answer that question because it's still unfolding as well, and I'm only, you know, outsider. I know people who are in these organizations, and I lived in Houston for 3 years, and so the community is, you know, close and dear to my heart as well. I think interesting thing that plays out that I see is unfolding is that the ability of like different organizations that care about the issue to work with the communities and the residents, and to, in addition to bringing them into meetings, making sure that they have transportation, for example, making sure that they have the information about the meetings beforehand, making sure that there's materials are being translated into different languages. There's also that the ability for them to kind of really try to develop a different narrative, alternative to the narrative of trans needs that is being offered through the highway expansion project. So I think the aspects of constructing an alternative kind of knowledge, that's knowledge production that is unfolding, that is something that is really fascinating to look into.
Yeah, no doubt. Do you see, I mean, obviously Texas is, like a Republican dominated state, but also there has been more conversation from Washington around infrastructural kinds of questions and some rethinking of that. Are you kind of hopeful? Is there an opening? Is this a moment for things to change? I mean, it just seems like there's also great power differentials in these conversations as well.
Yeah, I think it's good to always be hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with the new infrastructure bill, I think a lot of people are hopeful that there's a little bit of shifting of priorities.
Yeah.
I have not looked in depth to the bill, but I have used it as a way to teach about sustainable transportation with my students, and kind of we look at the compositions and the budget. We look at the different goals and the priorities set from the bill and what it can do, and obviously some of the challenges and limitations. So I think experientially, I through the different places that I lived through, I see a lot of people mobilizing, organizing, and looking for more options, right? So it's not, I think it's helpful to frame the conversation, not to say, this is us versus them, right? Not versus them who wants to drive versus us who wants to like more public transit, but it's not. It's really about kind of providing that options and making sure that all members of our community do have access to that options if it is available.
Yeah, that's well said, exactly. And there's also people use multiple modes. Someone might be driving a car one day and riding a bicycle the next, and taking the bus the day after that, and so on. So of course there's that too. So this brings me to one of the key reasons why I wanted to talk to you, Dian, which was also about this idea. So this project I'm working on, it's for this workshop on, it's not about automobility or planning. It's more just, it's a workshop on ideas of kind of the commons, public space, and theft, the role of theft within that, the relationship between property and theft. And I was thinking about automobility and the private car as a form of privatization of public space, because the road is public space, cars are privately owned things. And so I'm thinking about this connection, but I'm also unsure about it, which is why I'm also having some conversations with smart people who have been thinking about these issues. So is privatization a useful way to think about this? Is theft a useful way to think about this? What do you think about these kind of approaches to this topic?
I think that one thing that I talk with my students a lot is how we see road spaces, right, in our everyday life. Like exactly what you said, road is a public space. It was, it's constructed out of tax dollars, right? So like, so it's something that should, in theory, belong to, to the public, and yet, car is a private space. So there's that juxtaposition there, where it benefits when these road spaces that are funded by public funds are only benefit people who are able to purchase a car, or even just kind of utilize car as their main dominant mode, it becomes an interesting phenomenon where you'd see communities or people who claim road as their space. So, and I think I remember in Arlington, there was this, the most popular and contentious public meetings in that city was probably when they introduced a bicycle network. And they'd have people from businesses, from neighborhoods who are opposed to having a bicycle lane in their roads because it takes away their parking space, right? So parking space on road parking space is something else that some people have kind of seen it as a privilege of their home ownership. So so I think in that way you can kind of say it as a health, right, in a way that it shouldn't be something that is claimed as your own when it should benefit everyone. So when I talk to my students, in thinking about sustainable transportation, I try to get them to think about all those values that we attach to spaces, and what why is it that in our university, or in most places, right, in most colleges or most kind of complex, any kind of complex, that we'd have more parking space, square feet compared to building footprints, right? So like so why is that? Right? It's definitely also not, maybe it's not something that is particularly preferred by institutions to have that, but it could be something that is required by, kind of this at the city level, for example, or it can, so parking requirement is another thing, right? So and then also we were working with a community in Des Moines that has been impacted by kind of a highway expansion in the 1960s, 1970s. And, and the whole neighborhood was decimated, right? And so you'd have kind of some isolated pockets of generations that have lived and seen how the highway projects, the interstate projects really kind of decimated a lot of the African American communities and businesses. And now when I had a students who said that, like I really got, one time I just was curious in thinking about this neighborhood and mapping all of the parking spaces around this neighborhood. And so she drew just like a rectangle over that neighborhood. And you can kind of, it was mind blowing to see the isolation that was caused by dedicating these spaces to cars, right? Not even just to the movement of it, but to kind of like storing them.
And in many cases, white people's cars, so again, it does seem like there's something there to the longer histories of theft of African American property, communities, and so on, that this is kind of connected to. So this also connects up to another thing I wanted to ask you about, and it might seem a bit, several steps removed from your immediate research, but I'm also interested in thinking about the question of colonialism and automobility and the kinds of privatization that it represents. And I was thinking I wanted to ask you this, I mean, in an Indonesian context, as we were talking about before, if we think about the kind of, more socialist project that Indonesian independence represented from 1949 to 1965, and then the more kind of neo-colonial turn with Suharto, right? So there's a way that we could even think about like connecting Jakarta's notorious traffic situation to this kind of colonial dynamic, not so much to do with the Netherlands, but also to do with the United States, the kind of neo-colonial relationship between the US in Indonesia, especially after the coup.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, also thinking about the colonial kinds of relations that constitute the United States itself as built. Of course, there's the, there's the long history of slavery, obviously, is so important as, of course, a theft of human beings and labor. And then, of course, the land itself from indigenous communities that were there and are still there, but whose territory it was more officially before. So, when I talk to people about this, they're kind of like, okay, John, you're interested in colonialism and you're interested in cars, but it's too many steps to connect these things. Do you think there's a way that we can bring colonialism and cars into one kind of frame of analysis that makes sense?
Huh. Yeah, so I think, like you said, the history of Jakarta as a city is very much influenced, how it developed is very much influenced by colonialism, like kind of neocolonialism, and what each government prioritized in building. And it's still unfolding in a way with the announcement of the relocation of the capital city from Jakarta to Kalimantan. And also even just kind of from my architecture colleagues in terms of the contentions around even the design of, kind of the capital or the urban design of the buildings.
Yeah.
So I think it in terms of just the way roads are intensely kind of being constructed, and I think now even no, I don't know if I can make that connection. In a way, I'm going to try as much as I can to just based on my experience and what I kind of talk to people, have discussions with people, and the phenomenon that we are seeing even with the introduction of Uber to Jakarta. The taxi, right? The taxi that, because before, taxi is a way that is not as affordable as public transit, but it's a way for people to get to places and not have cars at the same time, right? And now with kind of just some of the, even the local companies, so not Uber, I think Indonesia, Jakarta has like their own local company that actually operates there. That you see less access to taxis, right? So there's more people who are striving and seeing car ownership as a way to make a living, and does justify that. And then that just adds to that cycle of traffic demand, obviously. And then also in terms of kind of thinking about car and identity, and just that it is a way, it's a hot mess.
Yeah.
with more congestion, you also seek more comfort, right? If it's going to be more congestion, so like, why can't I just sit comfortably in my own car, right? Compared to like in a public bus, and so the it's hard to trace back, I think, and most people that lives in Jakarta may not actually think about why we have a transportation system that's broken, and how the decisions of the government is really influenced by ideas of kind of what economic development, and why certain, and so maybe thinking back about kind of the knowledge production itself, right? Thinking about why there is more emphasis on constructions that relies on technical skills and knowledge that are kind of perhaps more influenced by the Western tradition, versus more of the kind of more reflections on the way of life of the local residents and communities. And also consumerism is a big thing, right? I think consumption and the push for more consumption, it's something that I always notice more as I move back from US and Jakarta, and kind of I definitely see more, more of that consumption oriented push for people to engage in, and car is one of that.
Yeah. That's a really helpful set of connections for me trying to think through this stuff as well, in a couple of ways. I mean, from the Uber to the consumerism part, the way that a kind of more specifically neoliberal form has emerged, but obviously comes, very much in a longer history of capitalist development and colonialism, both in the US and a place like Indonesia as well. But then also, exactly, to come back to the other parts about your research that we were talking about earlier, it's funny, it just became more clear to me as I was listening to you, thinking about one of the sort of key components of colonialism is the way that it subjugates knowledges, right, of the places that are being colonized. Mm-hmm. And subjugated knowledges is in important ways what you're also teaching us about with your work. So there are ways that we can think the knowledge question in relation to colonialism, in relation to urban planning, that to my mind so that's great. Thank you. That helps. That makes my work a little bit easier, learning from you in terms of ways to think about these connections. It's kind of funny to have an interview with an expert. I ask you about your work, and then I give you a few things about things I'm thinking about and get you to help me with them. So that's really, really appreciated, Dian.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear the directions of your work. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you as well.
That's great. Thank you. Let me ask you one quick question before you go. I've taken quite a bit of your time, but what are you working on now? What can we see from you coming ahead?
Yeah, so I've been working with a colleague of mine to also think about transportation, or the ideas of transportation rights and access as part of a right to the city. Kind of from the framework of right to the city, and also thinking about inclusion and participation, and the ways that resistance are kind of assembling things to develop certain narratives that can challenge those dominant knowledges that are being prioritized, and so trying to see how can we provide spaces for subjugated knowledges through this framework. So that's one thing, so that we're trying to kind of see the way the Houston case study unfolds from that lens. And also, I think I'm increasingly more interested in thinking about digital humanities and digital platforms. Part of my projects here look into even just kind of engagement with residents and thinking about providing access for them to occupy the digital spaces that, that at the beginning maybe just to highlight issues, and later on maybe move on to kind of more meaningful policy influences and engagement at the city level. So that's pretty much the gist. I think I teach a little bit more than before, so I'm trying to just balance that, and also just trying to get students to think about so I'm hoping to bring students to kind of Indonesia, right, to kind of see how the capital city's planning is unfolding. And so there's also something that I'm looking forward to, just to kind of learning more with experts, people who do research and kind of do planning practices in Indonesia, more about the issues of conservation, climate change, and urban sustainability in the world.
Wow, that's amazing. So many different things. Well, as a fan of the geographer Don Mitchell, you know, who writes on the right to the city, and as someone who's really interested in exactly how digital spaces, especially during COVID, when we turned to our laptops more than ever, can kind of impact the discourse. And as someone who should really register for one of your classes, that sounds so interesting. Let me just say thank you so much. Your work is obviously, you know, something for us to keep an eye on. And let me just thank you again for talking to me today.
Well, thank you, John, for providing the space and inviting me.